You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
There are few absolute truths in life, and one of those is that at some point in your life, you're going to have to wear clothes. That's just how things work. Everyone will also, at some point, have to wear pants. But what if you had one pair of pants for everything? That's where Jack Archer enters the conversation. Instead of needing different pants for work, travel, and weekends, the Jet Setter Tech Pant is designed to do more with one pair. Built for the office, golf course, date nights, and everything in between. They look nice when you need them to look nice. They feel comfy when you just want to relax. If you are anything like me, you keep wearing the same clothes day after day for a long time. And the Jet Set Tech Pant is built to stand up to that kind of long-term relationship. Right now, Jack Archer is offering our listeners 15% off your first order with the promo code GETJACK. So go to jackarcher.com and use promo code GETJACK for 15% off your first order and see why thousands of people have given the Jet Setter Tech Pant 5 stars. That's jackarcher.com, promo code GETJACK for 15% off of your first order.
I see you.
Avatar: Fire and Ash is now streaming on Disney+. It's the film critics are calling the best Avatar yet. A true epic and completely jaw-dropping.
This is the only pure thing in this world.
Return to Pandora on Disney+.
It will be an adventure for the whole fam.
And watch the Oscar-winning phenomenon at home.
This is sick!
Avatar: Fire and Ash, now streaming on Disney+. Rated PG-13.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 263, The War at Sea, 1941, Part 1, The Surface Raiders. This week, a big thank you goes out to Tailseeker, Dylan, and Kai for supporting the podcast by becoming members. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. One of the recurring themes of this podcast is how the decisions made by the leaders during the early months and years of the Second World War were influenced by the experiences of the First World War. You can add another example to that list in this series, during which we will discuss the German commerce raiding campaign of late 1940 and early 1941. This period of the Commerce War would have some of the same features as before and after, particularly the presence of German U-boats and their efforts to sink merchant ships on their way to Britain. But this period would also be unique because of the presence of German surface raiders during the 8 months between October 1940 and May 1941. The shadow of the First World War was an important impetus for this campaign, because in the aftermath of the Great War, the Imperial German Navy had been heavily criticized for its lack of proactive action against the Royal Navy. Before 1914, a tremendous amount of money had been spent on German warships, resulting in a naval arms race between Berlin and London. But then when the war started, all of those battleships, battlecruisers, cruisers, destroyers, and everything else spent most of their time sitting in German ports. They would make some trips out into the North Sea, but they would always retreat from the Royal Navy's Grand Fleet when given the opportunity for action. Then, when the war ended, the fleet would simply be surrendered to the British, with many feeling that it had been a tremendous waste of resources. Admiral Raeder, the head of the German Navy at the start of the Second World War, was determined that this would not be the case for his navy during his war. He would find a way to use the larger surface ships under his command. He would find a way to use them to hit British commerce, and they would just not sit around. They would not do nothing. The tools available to Raeder for this purpose were limited, and at the start of the war, he would have 2 heavy cruisers, 3 Panzerschiff, and 2 battleships, the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. Each of these had their own unique features and challenges when it came to commerce raiding. The heavy cruisers lacked range. The Panzerschiff were showing their age by the start of the war, and they were slow. And the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had small guns that made any encounter with large British ships an awkward proposition. In 1939, there were larger battleships on the horizon, though, with both the Bismarck and the Tirpitz being slated to join the fleet at some point in 1941. The good news was that the Royal Navy, while much stronger numerically than the Germans, were also spread out all over the globe, with the Mediterranean in particular absorbing much of the strength that could have been used to counter any German attempt at surface raiding. In many ways, the successes of the German surface raiders during 1940 and early 1941 would take advantage of this fact, although in the end the Royal Navy would be able to rise to the most important task, with the Bismarck never making it back from its maiden voyage. Over the next several months, we are going to track these developments and events. This would be the time when all of the work done by the Kriegsmarine in the 1920s and 1930s would come to fruition, and after its successes and failures during the first half of 1941, the naval war in the North Atlantic would never be the same. The planning for Germany's surface raiding campaign began during the 1920s, when there began to be discussions among the leaders of Germany's navy, which was much reduced due to the Versailles Treaty, about how they could use cruisers against British merchant shipping in the next war. This basic idea would then play a role in the design and development of the Panzerschiff, the armored ships that were powered by diesel engines that gave much greater range at the cost of being complicated. Over the course of the 1930s, 3 Panzerschiff would be built and added to the German Navy, with the last arriving in 1936 with the Admiral Graf Spee. Their range was important because, from the point of view of naval warfare, the German geographic situation was a nightmare. Due to their defeat during the First World War, all of Germany's overseas colonies had been taken from them and split among their enemies. This prevented any resupply efforts in ports around the world. Closer to home, the map of Europe also presented issues, with the German Navy only having access to the North Sea from a very small coastline. This made the Royal Navy's job much easier when it came to keeping the German ships contained, and while it was possible for German ships to make a run into the North Atlantic without being spotted, there were no guarantees on any voyage that they could actually make it into the Atlantic without being found, and that would put them at danger. One of the leading German naval theorists of the interwar years, Vice Admiral Wolfgang Wegener, believed that the absolute first priority for the German military should be to find a way to give the German Navy easier access to the Atlantic, but any such expansion would take time, and the geographic challenges would just have to be worked around in the early part of any war before the German army could capture more ports. Even with these geographic problems, right from the start of the war, the German Navy would begin commerce raiding, with the Panzerschiff used and the Admiral Graf Spee eventually having its date with destiny on the River Platte, which was covered back in episodes 157 and 158. It would not be until November that the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau would make their first appearance in the North Sea, with the 2 ships moving out for what would end up being a cautious and tentative move. The initial goal was not some grand commerce raiding adventure for these 2 battleships, but instead a simple test of the Royal Navy's efforts to create a cordon across the North Sea to prevent German ships from making their way into the Atlantic in late 1939. They would sink an armored merchant cruiser, but after reaching the Faroe Islands, they would turn around and return to port. An official German report would say, quote, "The appearance of our battleships in the Faroe Islands region has demonstrated that the enemy, despite his superiority, is incapable of maintaining command of the sea around his own shores." End quote. Although this was really being very optimistic about the impacts of the sortie and what it said for future operations, it would be the first of what would prove to be several times that the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau would work together in the years that followed, and they would be quite successful at it. After the initial careful efforts of 1939 and early 1940, most of which you can hear about during the earlier series here on the podcast from episodes 151 to 162, the entire structure of the naval war was altered by the German conquests during the spring of 1940. Initially, Raeder had supported the invasion of Norway specifically to gain access to Norwegian ports for his surface ships and for his U-boats. In mid-May, plans were even put forward for the work that would be required to turn Trondheim into the main German fleet base. But then France happened, and that once again changed everything. Before the fall of France, the German issue was that the place that it wanted its ships to be, the Atlantic, was on the other side of the British Isles, which were heavily protected and patrolled by the Royal Navy. This was a challenging situation on the outward journey, but made any attempt to return to German ports in the North Sea just as difficult. The French ports on the Bay of Biscay changed all of this. In the days before the armistice that was signed on June 22nd, the French Navy had begun a panicked evacuation of these ports, Brest and St. Nazaire being the largest. Everything that could float under its own power put to sea and made for North Africa, including French ships that were far from complete, like the Jean Bart that had not even done any engine tests before it was ordered to make its way with all speed to Morocco. The German ground forces then arrived in the port cities, and they very quickly came under German control, and it very quickly became clear how important these new ports would be. As soon as the Germans had captured the French ports, the entire landscape of the naval war shifted. Instead of having to make the run back through the North Sea to arrive at a German port to receive repairs, the German ships and U-boats could put into either Brest or St. Nazaire, both of which were very quickly brought back into action with any damage repaired so that they could serve this purpose for German ships. There was only one problem, and that was British air attack. Brest had the better and larger port facilities, which made it possible for even the largest German ships to get work done in the large dry docks. However, it was closer to Britain and therefore more likely to be attacked from the air, which it would be in the years that followed. St. Nazaire was further from Britain, which reduced the likelihood of air attack, but the facilities were far less impressive, and a German inspection group would realize that it was not really suitable for work on some German vessels. The only exception being that St. Nazaire had a large Normandy dry dock, which had been built during the 1930s to be used for large French warships. It was the largest dry dock in the world at the time of its construction, so obviously it was important and would be important, even if the rest of the facilities and the geography of St. Nazaire was less optimal for the German Navy. It would be this dry dock at St. Nazaire that would make that specific port so important, even if the German Navy would send more ships most of the time to Brest instead of St. Nazaire. The third port on the west coast of France that would be used was at Lorient, but that would be strictly for U-boats. After work started on the French ports to bring them into action for the Germans in October 1940, the plan for the next round of German naval attacks into the North Atlantic was put into action. The plan for these actions was outlined by Raeder in a meeting with Hitler in mid-October, and it was a plan that would be executed in 3 phases. The first was for the Deutschland-class cruiser, the Admiral Scheer, to break out into the Atlantic with the goal of going on a lengthy raiding campaign for really as long as possible. Then the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper would do the same in December 1940. Then in January 1941, the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau would follow in what would end up being the most successful of all of the German surface raiding missions. The goal would be for the ships to leave German ports, do their raiding while using pre-positioned supply ships to resupply and refuel at sea. Then at some point, they would put into French ports for a refit and for a resupply, and then they could either go back out on another surface raiding cruise, or if they were damaged in some way, they could come back to Germany. Which path would be taken would largely be decided by the damage suffered and the work that needed to be done to bring the ships back up to proper fighting shape. This plan would set the stage for the next 8 months of the Atlantic Naval War, and will also set the stage for the next several podcast episodes, as you might imagine. During the naval fighting that would occur during these Atlantic raids, the availability and reliability of intelligence would be crucial for both sides as they sought to achieve their goals. At the Admiralty, the Royal Navy had put in place a top-tier intelligence group which fed information into the Operations Division. The Operations Division then had direct control of all actions in the North Atlantic and the waters around Britain. This centralized control would make it much easier to control both the flow of convoys as well as the hunting for any German warship that should prove to be necessary. They would use as much information as they could get their hands on to try and track German actions, both on the surface and with U-boats, but they were limited in what they had access to. The German naval codes would prove to be a tough nut to crack, and during the period of surface raiding operations between October 1940 and May 1941, the British could not read German naval messages, at least on a consistent enough basis to count on them for operational intelligence. But that did not mean that the Royal Navy was completely blind, and they would be generally pretty good about finding intelligence about when German operations started and ended. This was primarily due to the fact that serious effort was put into aerial reconnaissance of German port facilities to track the preparations and departures of German ships. Then in the North Sea and in the seas between Greenland, Iceland, and Scotland, Royal Navy patrols were generally always in place. However, if a ship made it out into the Atlantic, everything became much more difficult, simply because they would have such a larger area to hide in. To counterbalance against this a little bit, there were a growing number of Royal Navy ships with radar equipped, but radar by its nature is line of sight only, which limited the ability of these ships to search the Atlantic. But if they found a ship, they could keep contact with it, like what would happen with the Bismarck. Also, if the German ships sent radio signals, the possibility did exist to do radio direction finding. But this was again quite inconsistent, and the Germans knew that their radio messages could be tracked, which often caused them to maintain at least some level of radio discipline and not be sending a bunch of messages back and forth. The intelligence situation on the German side would be quite different to what the British experienced. The first major difference was that, at least during the period of the surface raiders, the Germans could read British naval messages. As would so often happen during the war for all sides, the ability of the Germans to read British naval messages kind of came and went over the course of the war. But the Germans had started the war being able to read British naval messages because they had cracked the code. Then a code change in August 1940 prevented messages from being read, but then after a few months of work, the codes were broken again, and by January 1941, they were back to being able to read them all. This allowed them to have good information on British convoys, their escorts, and British fleet movements just kind of in general. Any information that could be obtained about the positioning and movements of the Royal Navy had a huge impact on the course of action in the Atlantic because it played into the Royal Navy's largest problem. It had to protect a lot of stuff. When combating surface raiders like the German cruisers and battleships, the only option that the British could come up with was to increase the combat power of convoy escorts. This would eventually result in battleships being used as convoy escorts along with cruisers and destroyers. This was the precise opposite of how naval power was designed to be used. But without the ability to track where the German ships were, it was the only available option to keep them from attacking convoys. There probably would have been a breaking point with this strategy as well, where it no longer would have been effective. But that would not have occurred until the point where probably both the Bismarck and the Tirpitz could be in action at the same time. That period of the war was a major concern for the British as soon as it became clear that the Germans were working on the two large battleships. If they worked together, they could tie down a huge portion of the British fleet just by existing, and that would make it easier for the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau in the Atlantic. But in 1940, this doomsday scenario for the Royal Navy was still at least a year in the future, if it ever happened. And for the purposes of these episodes, the fact that the British could post battleship or large cruiser escorts for the convoys was often enough to make the German surface raiders at least very hesitant to engage, because any damage that they suffered could mean the loss of the ship as they tried to get back to port. Now let's dive into a specific surface raider operation, and that would be the raids of the Admiral Scheer in late 1940, or which would begin in late 1940. The Deutschland-class cruiser had not been present for the campaign in Norway due to an engine issue that had been plaguing the ship since the start of the war, and this would result in the Scheer spending most of 1940 in port receiving repairs, which meant that it was very much ready to go when it came to October and it was time to do the surface raiding expedition. On October 23rd, the Scheer would leave Gottenhaven 3 days after its designated supply ship, the Nordmark, also left the same port. As with the Admiral Graf Spee, the Scheer would work closely with the Nordmark throughout the voyage, using it as a fuel and supply ship, as well as a place to hold any captured sailors that were taken off of merchant ships before they were sunk. The Scheer would then enter the North Sea on the 27th of October with the goal of making for the Denmark Strait to the north of Iceland. On the 31st of October, the ship would pass through the strait without being detected by the British. Scheer's first victim would then be spotted on November 5th. It would be the small freighter Mopam, which was sailing solo between the Caribbean and Britain. All 72 men that were on board the Mopan would be brought on board the Scheer before it was sunk by the Scheer's main guns, so there would be no casualties. But the real prize for the Scheer, the whole reason that it was doing its thing, was not small solo freighters, but instead convoys. And also, later on November 5th, the Scheer's scout plane would find exactly what it was looking for when it spotted Convoy HX-84. HX-84 was a 37 merchant ship convoy, with the HX designation meaning that it was a fast convoy that had started its journey in Halifax and it was on its way to Britain. This was exactly the kind of convoy that the Germans most valued trying to attack, and it would be protected by only one armed merchant cruiser, the HMS Jervis Bay. Armed merchant cruisers were not built to be military ships, but were instead merchant ships that were turned into escorts by adding a few guns. In the case of the Jervis Bay, these were 4 6-inch guns. These might have been sufficient in other circumstances, like when firing on a surfaced U-boat, but as soon as the German cruiser was spotted, those 6-inch guns were quite inadequate for the task at hand. Not only were the guns smaller than the Scheer's 11-inch guns, but the Jervis Bay also did not have the fire control systems that were required to engage ships at a reasonable range. The Admiral Scheer did have such fire control systems, and these allowed the Scheer to straddle the Jervis Bay on its third salvo, sending a shell near the bridge. The fourth salvo would see 2 shells actually connect, and immediately fire started on the Jervis Bay. The fifth salvo would then basically tear the ship apart. Soon the severely injured captain had to give the order to abandon ship as the flames moved towards the bridge, and the Jervis Bay would eventually roll over and sink, with 186 men being lost, and 68 being rescued from the water by a Swedish steamer. The Scheer did not stick around to watch the sinking of the Jervis Bay, and was instead busy attacking the convoy that it had been protecting. The Scheer was racing against the clock, as it was already early evening by the time that the Scheer started off towards the members of the convoy, who were actively scattering to try and reduce the number that the German ship could attack. There would still be several more victims, though, with the first being the SS Maydan, which was sunk with all hands, then the tanker St. Demetrio, which would be heavily damaged but would eventually make it to port, then 2 more freighters would be sunk, the Kinbanehead and the Trellwillard. The final victim would be the Beaverford, which would put up far more of a fight than expected, which would end up saving the other ships of the convoy, actually. The Beaverford would not continue to run as soon as it came under fire, but would instead head towards the German cruiser, apparently in an attempt to buy time for the other ships of the convoy. This would actually work, and even though the Beaverford would be sunk with the loss of everyone on board, it would take long enough for it to be sunk, and it would make the Scheer sort of maneuver to be in a bad position to then try and seek other convoy targets. In total, 5 ships would be sunk and 3 damaged during the attack on HX-84. One of the reasons that the Admiral Scheer did not continue to press home the attack is that as soon as it started attacking the convoy, it started dispersing, which made chasing individual ships difficult. But also there was a concern that any of the ships could have gotten a contact report off to the Royal Navy, which was the standard practice for convoys. They basically started radioing anybody that would listen that a German ship was attacking, and theoretically the Royal Navy could then vector in ships to try and intercept the German cruiser. So the Admiral Scheer had to eventually get away from that area, and it turned south and made for the South Atlantic. On November 12th, it would rendezvous with 2 different supply ships, the supply ship Nordmark, which it was working closely with, and it would pass over supplies to the Admiral Scheer, and the Nordmark would take on the prisoners that had been taken on board from the Mopan. The second ship would be the tanker Eurofeld, which transferred fuel over to the Scheer so that it could continue on its way. For the next month, the Scheer would wander around in the commerce lanes between the Caribbean and West Africa, but during that time only 2 merchant ships would be found and engaged. In the hopes of finding more targets, and after topping off the diesel tanks from the Eurofeld once again, the Scheer would make its way to the South Atlantic. Then from there, it would make a trip to the Indian Ocean that would last until the first days of March. In both the South Atlantic and the Indian Ocean, another few merchant ships would be sunk or captured, and for the entirety of March, the Scheer would make its way back home, with the return journey into the North Sea and then into Kiel in Germany being just as dangerous as the outward journey had been, but just as successful. The final numbers for the cruise would be 13 merchant ships sunk, 3 captured, and 1 armed merchant ship destroyed, for a grand total of 113,622 tons of shipping. It was an impressive feat, with the ship having traveled almost 50,000 nautical miles on its cruise. This did mean, though, that it would require a very thorough refit after returning, which would keep it out of action for several months. But beyond just the list of merchant ships that were captured or destroyed, the cruise of the Admiral Scheer would have one very important impact and response from the Royal Navy. Because the Scheer's attack on HX-84 back at the beginning of November would result in the decision that every Atlantic convoy would be escorted by a battleship. Along with this, there would always be 2 battleships in the home fleet prepared to deal with any surface raiders that might appear. This change would be important because it would be made just in time to impact the raids by the German ships starting in early 1941. And that would be a period during which both the highs and the low points of the German surface raiding campaign would be experienced, and the highs were high, and the lows were real low. We'll start talking about some of those next episode.